There is a country blessed beyond measure, a land so rich that beneath its soil lies black gold, oil in such abundance that it could fuel prosperity for generations. A land where fertile farmland stretches wide, rivers snake across the savanna, and millions of hands are ready to work. That country is Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, its largest economy, and by all measures, one of the richest in natural resources. Yet, here lies the great paradox. Despite pumping over 2 million barrels of oil every single day, despite generating hundreds of billions of dollars over decades, boasting a GDP of over $400 billion, Nigeria cannot feed itself. Each year, it spends more than $10 billion importing food. Rice from Thailand, wheat from America, fish from Norway, shipped across oceans to feed a country that should be one of the world's greatest breadbaskets. This is a story of how unimaginable wealth became a national trap, of how the promise of prosperity turned into dependency, and how one of Africa's most resource-rich nations ended up trapped in poverty, hunger, and corruption. Black gold and the paradox of plenty. In the late 1950s, oil was discovered in Oloibiri, a small community in the Niger Delta. At first, it seemed like a blessing. Money began flowing in like never before. By the 1970s, Nigeria had joined OPEC, oil revenues surged, and the country suddenly found itself swimming in cash. It was said that Nigeria had more money than it knew how to spend. But here's the irony of oil wealth. It's not always a blessing. Economists call it the resource curse. Political scientists call it the paradox of plenty. And in Nigeria, it became a textbook case. Instead of investing in farms, schools, factories, and infrastructure, leaders chose the easy route. They relied almost entirely on oil. Oil exports soon accounted for over 90% of government revenue and foreign exchange earnings. Nigeria became addicted to petroleum, abandoning the very sectors that had once sustained it, from breadbasket to beggar. Before oil, Nigeria was an agricultural giant. Groundnuts from the north, cocoa from the west, palm oil from the east. Nigerian farms fed not just the nation, but much of the region. In the 1960s, agriculture made up more than 60% of GDP, employing the majority of the population. But oil changed everything. Farmers were neglected, investment dried up, young people left the fields for the cities, chasing oil money that seemed endless. By the 1980s, Nigeria had gone from a food exporter to a massive food importer. Today, it spends over $10 billion a year, bringing in food it could easily produce itself. The paradox deepens when you realize that Nigeria still has over 70 million hectares of arable land fertile enough to feed not just Nigeria, but much of Africa. Yet, year after year, the ships keep coming, loaded with rice, wheat, sugar, and milk. The gasoline irony. But the strangest paradox of all is this. Nigeria, one of the world's largest oil producers, cannot refine its own petroleum products. Imagine a pizza factory that grows wheat, tomatoes, and cheese, but still buys frozen pizzas from abroad. That's Nigeria. The country pumps millions of barrels of crude oil daily, but imports refined petrol, diesel, and kerosene. Why? Because the state-owned refineries, built in the 1970s and 1980s, were allowed to collapse. Corruption, mismanagement, and neglect turned them into rusting relics. So Nigeria exports crude oil, only to buy back refined products at higher prices. It is a paradox that bleeds the economy dry, drains foreign reserves, and leaves ordinary Nigerians at the mercy of global price shocks. Dutch disease. When wealth destroys. When oil money started pouring into Nigeria, it looked like a blessing from the heavens, but in reality, it carried a hidden curse. Economists call it Dutch disease. The idea is simple. When a country suddenly earns huge foreign revenue from one resource, its currency strengthens. That sounds good at first. Strong currency, strong nation. But here's the catch. Everything else becomes uncompetitive. For Nigeria, this meant farmers couldn't sell their crops because imported food suddenly became cheaper. Why struggle to grow rice in Kano when the markets were flooded with cheaper rice from Thailand? Why bother producing palm oil when it was easier to import it with petrodollars? Slowly but surely, agriculture, the backbone of Nigeria's economy for centuries, began to wither. Manufacturing followed the same path. Local industries couldn't keep up with foreign goods, and factories shut down one after another. Oil didn't just create wealth, it destroyed everything else. By the 1980s, Nigeria had become a textbook monoculture, an oil state where agriculture, industry, and innovation were smothered under the weight of petrodollars. Where did the money go? Even worse than the economic distortion was the vanishing act of the money itself. Over the the decades, Nigeria earned more than $600 billion from oil. That's enough to build a nation as modern as Dubai not once, but 10 times over. Enough to give every Nigerian a life of dignity, comfort, and opportunity. But instead of building a future, the money evaporated. Where did it go? Into private pockets. Corruption became the bloodstream of the nation. Oil wealth, instead of paving roads and funding hospitals, found its way into foreign bank accounts, luxury yachts, and sprawling mansions in London, Dubai, and New York. Military rulers and politicians alike treated Nigeria's oil industry as their personal ATM. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, became infamous as a black hole where billions disappeared without a trace. The oil boom of the 1970s should have been Nigeria's golden era. Instead, it became a lost decade that spiraled into the oil doom of the 1980s and 1990s. Ordinary Nigerians got none of the miracle they were promised. Instead, they lived with collapsing schools, pothole-ridden roads, endless blackouts, and poverty in the shadow of obscene wealth. Oil was supposed to lift Nigeria. Instead, it strangled the very foundations of its economy and then was stolen in broad daylight. The subsidy trap. To make matters worse, Nigeria introduced fuel subsidies, supposedly to help its citizens. In theory, this meant cheaper petrol for everyone. In practice, it became one of the most corrupt systems in modern history. Billions were spent every year to keep fuel prices artificially low, but much of the money never reached the people. Instead, a cartel of fuel importers, government officials, and middlemen siphoned off the funds. Fuel subsidies became a black hole. They distorted the economy, encouraged smuggling, and drained resources that could have gone into healthcare, education, or infrastructure. And yet, whenever a government tried to remove subsidies, protests erupted. Cheap fuel had become a lifeline for millions struggling to survive. The subsidy system turned into a vicious cycle, too corrupt to continue, too politically dangerous to remove. Attempts at diversification. It's not that Nigeria hasn't tried. Over the decades, leaders rolled out one ambitious plan after another, each dressed in big slogans and lofty promises. In the late 1970s came Operation Feed the Nation, a campaign to revive agriculture and make Nigeria self-sufficient in food. Billboards showed smiling farmers, jingles filled the radio, and politicians promised a new green dawn. But the farms never came alive. Corruption swallowed funds, urban elites had no interest in farming, and cheap food imports, made possible by oil dollars, undercut local production. Then came the Green Revolution in the 1980s, another bold push to boost agriculture. Once again, huge sums were announced, committees were formed, and speeches delivered. But by the time the money trickled down, most of it had already disappeared into private pockets. In the 1990s, the government drafted Vision 2010, a master plan to transform Nigeria into a diversified powerhouse by the dawn of the new millennium. When that failed, it was replaced with Vision 2020, which promised to make Nigeria one of the world's top 20 economies by 2020. Instead, by 2020, Nigeria was battling recession, debt, and unemployment. More recently, policymakers rolled out the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan after the 2016 oil crash. The message was the same: diversify, industrialize, reduce dependence on oil. But again, implementation lagged behind rhetoric. Why did every plan fail? Because oil revenues were just too easy, too tempting. Diversification requires discipline, long-term planning, and investment in infrastructure. But oil gave quick money. It was simpler to keep selling crude and pocketing the proceeds than to build factories, fund research, or modernize farming. And so, the cycle continued. Nigeria talked about diversification for half a century, yet remained chained to oil, like an addict who promises to quit tomorrow but never does. Breaking free, can Nigeria escape the oil curse? The answer is yes, but it won't be easy. It will require investment in agriculture, manufacturing, and technology. It will require fixing the power sector, reviving refineries, and ending the subsidy madness. Most of all, it will require leadership. Leaders who see oil not as a personal fortune, but as a national resource to be managed wisely. Other countries have done it. Botswana used diamonds to build a stable economy. Norway turned oil into a sovereign wealth fund for future generations. Nigeria can learn from these examples. But time is running out. The world is moving away from fossil fuels. Oil may not remain the cash cow forever. If Nigeria does not diversify now, the curse will deepen when the wells run dry. Conclusion: Nigeria's oil curse is not just about economics. It is about choices. Choices made by leaders who squandered wealth. Choices made by societies that tolerated corruption. Choices that turned abundance into scarcity. The lesson is clear. Natural resources alone do not make a nation rich. Institutions, leadership, and good governance do. Oil can build a country, but oil can also destroy it. So what can you do about this? First, share this video. Most people don't realize how Africa's richest country became dependent on food imports. Second, subscribe because we're going to keep exposing the hidden economic stories that shape your world. And third, drop a comment. Do you think Nigeria can ever break free from the curse of oil, or will it remain trapped in the paradox of plenty? Next week, Saudi Arabia's oil empire. How one family controls global energy.